Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan Unshuffled and to a very special episode here. I'm going to be doing an album rankings episode. Been a little while since I've done one of these, but they're always super fun to go through and I know a lot of people enjoy these. And what better thing to do than to rank one of my favorite artists of all time, probably my favorite artist of all time actually. This is Neal Morse's solo catalog that I'm about to attempt to rank here. And so this is some of my favorite albums of all time. I really love Neal Morse. He's one of the most prolific in the modern era of progressive rock. He started up with Spock's Beard in the mid-1990s and has continued on from there. After he left Spock's Beard, he continued on with solo projects. And then he's also worked with a big supergroup titled Transatlantic. He's done stuff as the Neal Morse Band. He started other offshoot projects such as Flying Colors. And he's just been a genius musician who's put out music very regularly and has a sprawling discography up to this point. And sometimes it's hard to know which albums to include in an episode like this because of how sprawling his discography is and how he does stuff under many different monikers. But what I've decided to do here for this show is to focus on Neal Morse solo material in the prog vein, mainstream prog, Neal Morse solo material. So that's going to include all of his solo works, starting with Testimony after he left Spock's Beard and moving all the way through, including Neal Morse Band, including some of his like musical style offshoots, and now with The Resonance, his most current project. So all of that will be included. I wanted to include the newest album, No Hill for a Climber, which comes out this week. So thought it'd be fun to slot that in with all the rest of his mini albums. Several concept records in this mix, several double albums. It's just a really impressive catalog of music that I'm absolutely in love with. So that's the disclaimer, is I absolutely love and adore all of these albums. So if one's ranked low that you're surprised about, it's still an album I love. He has no bad albums in my opinion. And I've already ranked Spock's Beard albums, so go see that show if you're interested in how I ranked the Spock's Beard catalog. I've already ranked Transatlantic albums, and I've already ranked Neal Morse Band albums actually on its own episode, but I'm going to include those in this one as well to give a more complete picture of Neal's solo work. So I hope this will be a fun episode for you guys and a chance for me to gush about my favorite artist of all time, who I think is highly underrated and deserves all the praise that he can muster. So without further ado, let me start with number 16 on my list. And this is clearly for me Jesus Christ the Exorcist from 2019. And I've just never really fallen in love with this record compared to pretty much anything else on this list. I don't prefer his more musical style. Musical theater style, I should say. I feel like he sacrificed a bit of like the bombastic prog that I've come to love him for. But that being said, there's still plenty of great moments, great little things on this record to enjoy. There's some of those like gentle giant-y vocal rounds present on some tracks. There's a bit of like big expansive overtures and proggy bits here and there. A big, of course, epic conclusion. And he invites a whole host of different guests that are in kind of the Neal Morse world to star in this album, to do the different vocal spots, because of course this album tells the story of Jesus, like in the New Testament, his life and his death and resurrection and all of that story is all presented here in epic fashion, not unlike Jesus Christ Superstar from Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I think it's an interesting ride. It's interesting storytelling. There's a lot of interesting vocal moments from the different guests, and that's probably one of the reasons why I rank it lower too, is because I've come to love Neal Morse's vocals and equate that with Neal Morse's material. Like, I feel like it needs to have his voice on it for me to really feel like it's a Neal Morse album. And he gives away the vocal duties to a whole host and cast of different characters. You know, Ted Leonard basically has a main starring role in this. And so it just doesn't feel as classic Neal Morse to me. But I appreciate him doing something a bit different. And he performed this at Morse Fest, which really lifted it up in my estimation. I think the live performance of it really kind of brings these things to life. But otherwise, it's probably the lowest of the totem pole for me. And of course, more because that's not my style. I more prefer his bombastic, full-on prog epics and extravaganzas, and this doesn't quite hit the mark for me on that front. At number 15, similarly, we're going to be talking about the Joseph album, Joseph Part 1, The Dreamer, which came out in 2023, just last year, so this is a very recent record. And I thought it was an improvement over Jesus Christ the Exorcist. I was worried when I heard he was doing another kind of musical theater style type album with a similar concept. You know, it's a biblical story told by a cast of characters. But this time around, Neal does like the main vocal, so that really helps me feel like it's more a core Neal Morse album. And he decided to make it more rock-oriented, where I felt like he really embraced the musical theater and stuff on Jesus Christ the Exorcist. This one has a bit of like this rock-oriented feel. Has a few proggy moments, of course, in like the overture and through different segments throughout the record. But overall, it just feels like a really strong rock opera with a couple different guest spot vocalists and an interesting story well told. And I like Neal's vocal performance. And there's some heartfelt moments, there's some emotion baked in, and it's just a really interesting concept brought to life. Of course, it feels a bit unfinished because it's just a part one, so you leave the story kind of in the middle of things, which I find interesting because it's like, you know, fun to anticipate that there's a second part to this album, but also makes it feel perhaps a bit incomplete since it kind of sits on its own and maybe doesn't work so well without the second part in tandem. So it lies in a kind of weird zone for me, but I really enjoy it, even if it's not quite to the heights of his pure progressive music. But I really respect what he's trying to do, and I think it's a step better than what he was trying to accomplish on Jesus Christ the Exorcist. Which leads to number 14, which is Joseph Part 2, The Restoration, from earlier this year. And I feel like he stepped up the game a little bit on this one. This brought the Joseph project full circle. It does a lot of reprises of some of the Part 1 material, and I feel like it went heavier into the prog direction that I was hoping for and really takes cues from a lot of his different prog type things that he does on his full-blown prog albums. You know, it has some of that like Gentle Giant-y vocal round stuff. It has some quirky like Latin sections, not unlike Senior Velasco. He's willing to go into jazzy moments and different styles and bring them all to the forefront. It's a sprawling album. It has a lot of guest singers once again, and I love how it reprises some of the best moments from Joseph Part 1. It really brought the whole project together for me and made it a lot more satisfying than just Joseph Part 1 on its own. So for that reason, that's why it places a little bit better than Part 1, because I think it more fully realized the story, and without it, Part 1 doesn't really work at all for me, whereas Part 2 stands a little bit better on its own, but brings the whole project to its full fruition when you hear parts 1 and 2 in tandem. So it helped me to better appreciate this side of Neal's sound, which previously was not really my favorite. Like I said, the musical theater, basically like a play set to music with different characters portraying, you know, different singers portraying different characters and things. Just not really my thing. It can feel a bit cheesy to me, in fact, but it all works a lot better on this release, on the Part 2, where I thought, okay, now I can kind of hear what he's trying to do, and I felt like it best melded these two worlds together of his musical theater background with this more progressive rock style and created an album that was much more interesting to my ears than some of these others. Number 13 for me is Solo Gratia, which came out in 2020. Somewhat of a pandemic album, I suppose. This was like the band, Neal Morse band, couldn't get together because of, you know, the pandemic was forcing people apart, and it was harder to get together as a band in that era. So I think that's where Solo Gratia came out of, trying to think of what kind of an album he could put out on his own. And he went back into the well of like a Sola Scriptura, somewhat of a sequel album to Sola Scriptura, in fact, but focused on a different character, of course, this time, but has a lot of callbacks to the Sola Scriptura universe with a lot of cool, like darker, heavier sounds that Sola Scriptura was known for. And so I really love it. I love the callbacks. I love, you know, a lot of interesting tracks and songs. Seemingly Sincere is one of my favorite of his more recent era. I think it's a really cool sprawling track that does things a little bit different, and I love the little instrumental interludes, and you know, it's a fun album, but it does feel not as completely realized, I think, as some of his other works because of the nature of how it came about, that it was a pandemic album. He did it all himself. Of course, I think the drums were brought together by Mike Portnoy, who was able to drum from his home studio and contribute to the record. So we still have a lot of the same faces and members that we're used to on a Neal Morse album, but it just doesn't feel as special. It feels a little bit less collaborative, like this is just Neal doing his own thing without bringing on board a lot of other opinions and minds to the table. And although it does call back sola scriptura, I think in the back of my mind it's like, well, it's fun to have these little callbacks, but sola scriptura to me is just a far superior record. So it just serves to remind me of an album that I prefer much more, that I think is a lot bigger and greater in scope. But this album is successful on its own. Also, I still play it from time to time. I still think it's a great album and has a lot of interesting parts to it, but it's probably one of the least memorable in his recent catalog for me, so that ranks it a little bit lower. At number 12, I have Lifeline from 2008, which I feel like came out in an interesting spot. It kind of had an unfortunate placement in his discography because he had done this great run of these big, brilliant concept records, and then he kind of took a break from that with this album to do just more of a normal, standard album with various songs. And so it didn't hit quite the same way that his big, epic concept albums did. And that's what I love Neal for, is his big brain concept records that are sprawling and every song runs together. And it all serves as a single story and has these epic callbacks and all this kind of stuff. I think he's brilliant at doing that. So Lifeline was a little bit of a letdown that it was just a collection of songs, even though they were good songs. I think the title track Lifeline is really one of his best. I think it's a fun song, a great album opener with just enough cool progginess on board. I love Leviathan, one of his cool, quirky, heavier tracks that kind of takes you by surprise, and he's done several of those more recently also. And of course the big epic, So Many Roads, is a fantastic epic track that follows his similar structure and has a big epic build up, but really fun, quirky parts throughout, and it hangs together really well and sounds really great to my ears. So it's the shorter tracks beyond those that don't really fit for me, that kind of lean more into his Christian rock aesthetic, God's Love, Children of the Chosen. They're pleasant songs. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. But they just don't hit quite as hard, and unfortunately for me and for my ears. I do like that it came with a bonus track with a couple of extra songs that I think were actually very strong and fun to listen to, so that boosts it up a little bit. But compared to his output around this time of his material, this one just dipped a little bit in quality for me, even though there's some really impressive, great stuff on it. And I still listen to it regularly like all these other albums, and still think there's plenty here to recommend and enjoy. Even his lower tier albums are still like A-level music for me in the prog spectrum. So definitely, just because it's ranked lower here doesn't mean it's not worth your time and attention. At number 11, I have Momentum from 2012. And maybe this deserves to be a step higher than this, but for similar reasons as Lifeline, it just felt like a very solid collection of songs without really standout moments that come to mind when I'm thinking of the best of Neal's catalog. Like, none of these tracks strike me as like the top tier best of Neal Morse's catalog, even if the end product, the end album, is actually pretty solid and every song has something quirky and unique about it. The title track Momentum is just one of his more poppier, more accessible anthemic songs that's a lot of fun to listen to with enough prog flourishes to keep the prog fans happy. He has another epic on this one, World Without End, which I think is probably an underrated epic. It's really strong, has some really cool instrumental firework moments. There's some cool quirky bits. There's some really emotional, big epic moments towards the end. It's a really fun track that breezes along and doesn't feel as long as it is, even though it's like 30 minutes long or something. So I love that track, and I think that raises the album quite a bit. I think it has Thoughts Part 5, which is an interesting callback to his Thoughts days in Spock's beard, and has some quirky fun in it as well. But it's, like I said, it just doesn't stick with me quite as much as some of his other projects. It seems to be one of the more forgettable of his solo career albums, even if when I listen to it, I'm like, wow, this is more solid than I remembered, and has some really cool, quirky, interesting things on it. A lot of people at the time hailed this as kind of like a return to his more Spock's-beard style aesthetic after these very Christian-themed concept records. So it was a breath of fresh air for a lot of people at the time. But for me, as a lover of his like epic concept records that he was doing, it was not quite on the same level as those, even though it was really solid and fun Neal Morse music to enjoy. But I thought he'd step it up a bit better on his next record, which is at number 10, The Grand Experiment, which is the first Neal Morse Band record from 2015, which I think took some of the lessons from Momentum and excelled in a bigger way, because it's similarly structured. You know, it has kind of the big anthemic opening track. It has a big epic to close out the record and a couple smaller tracks in the middle, which is not unlike a more recent album that we'll be talking about soon also. He loves this kind of structure on his non-concept records. You know, it's similar to V from Spock's Beard. It's similar to Bridge Across Forever, having these kind of bookended big epic tracks and then a smattering of kind of smaller, more, you know, quirky tracks in the middle. This was a great statement from the Neal Morse Band, and I think what's cool about this and raises it slightly above Momentum for me is the other band members bringing their own flavor and their own style to kind of refresh Neal's sound, which I feel was needed at this time in his career. And so bringing in Bill Hubauer, who does a lot of cool writing and has some great sections. Bringing in Eric Gillette, who has a great voice and great guitar playing that brings a youth and a freshness to the music. Officially bringing on board Mike Portnoy and Randy George, who of course had worked with him in his solo material up to this point already. But forming this into an actual band and bringing a more band feel to this rather than just Neal Morse, the director, kind of crafting all this himself and bringing on people to kind of help. This was more of a band effort, and you can hear it in the cohesion of these tracks. The Call that starts out the record is one of the most anthemic, cool songs in the Neal Morse Band discography. They play it often live, and it's just a really fantastic track that showcases all the strengths of the band. Goes through many different cool sections, showcases all the vocal abilities. That's one of the highlights of Neal Morse Band, is this kind of 3-part harmonies they're able to do, because they have basically 3 singers in the band trading off lyrics. And I really love the epic, Alive Again. I think it's a fantastic epic that soars, gives all the members a chance to shine. There's a cool Bill Hubauer written section that I think is a really fun diversion in the song. There's some cool like classical infused fugue bits that I really like from him. So it's just a really fabulous record. And even the shorter tracks are a lot of fun to listen to. Maybe Agenda is the weakest of the group for me. But beyond that, I think it's really solid. I love Waterfall. It's just such a beautiful song, acoustic, with a lot of harmonies. And the Grand Experiment title track is just a really cool, more anthemic, kind of poppier track like Momentum. Just a really fun experience. And it has a cool bonus track with a really epic proggy cover of MacArthur Park, which I absolutely love. So it's a great record and a great statement for Neal Morse Band that we're here and this is what we're doing now. And it reinfused Neal with a lot of excitement and power. And number 9, we have No Hill for a Climber with The Resonance, the album that's coming out this week as I'm recording this. This is a very recent album. Maybe many of you haven't heard it yet as watching this episode, perhaps. But I think it does a lot of what The Grand Experiment did. You know, it reinfuses Neal with some new energy, with some new young talent. He's bringing on these Nashville musicians who have a lot of youth and vibrancy, who add a lot to the table to this music. And it's structured in a similar fashion. It has the bookended epics that are both fantastic in their own right. I love the opening epic. I think it showcases Neal at his best. Chris Riley contributed a lot of quirky sections in this opening epic, like Northern Lights and Hammer and Nail, and also in the closing epic as well, the big title track, which I think has that kind of cool, mysterious Eastern style quality that Neal infuses in some of his tracks as well, like The Great Nothing from Spock's Beard, like stuff on Question Mark and Soul Scriptura. Just a really cool vibe, and the middle tracks are also really interesting and showcase different sides to his sound as well. Thief is just really cool, quirky, jazzy kind of song with a crazy King Crimson-esque instrumental workout. You've got Ever Interceding, which is just a beautiful ballad, one of the best that he's crafted, with some really great vocals. And All the Rage is another big anthemic track that just showcases Neal at his catchiest best. So it's just a fabulous record that is surprising to me because, I thought he was going more in this musical theater direction with the Joseph albums. I thought, he's also doing a lot of singer-songwriter type stuff and also the, Di Virgilio Morse Jennings trio. I thought that was more the direction he was headed in, and maybe the Neal Morse Band big epic style prog was at least on hold for a while, if not gone indefinitely because of Mike's involvement with Dream Theater and all of that. But it's nice to know he still has prog in him, and he's still able to produce these big prog epic masterpieces like this. And so because of that surprise factor, because of how strong the album is, even though it doesn't have the traditional Neal Morse Band members, these new young fresh faces are still able to infuse energy and virtuosity onto the table to craft great Neal Morse music that feels vibrant and youthful, just like his classic Spock's Beard material. So brilliant stuff being done here, and well-deserving to be basically right in the middle of the pack here on my ranking list, only because his top-tier albums are just so high in my estimation. It's impossible to cross that barrier, but over time, maybe this album will rise in the ranks and be even better. Number 8 for me is Innocence and Danger from 2021. This is another Neal Morse Band release, the last Neal Morse Band that we've had. And interestingly, they split it into 2 discs, somewhat of the Innocence side, which is the shorter, more accessible tracks, and then the Danger side was disc 2 with 2 lengthy epics. And although maybe this feels like they're maybe separating things a bit too much, and maybe it would be interesting to see how they'd integrate these tracks to make it feel like a more cohesive album, it was an interesting experiment. And I love all the tracks on here. The catchy shorter tracks are all fun in their own right, have some really cool moments. It's not like they're all ballads and slow paced and poppier. There's still plenty of prog and plenty of heaviness in those tracks, but they get a chance to explore some of their like Jellyfish ELO, style material with those tracks. Steely Dan comes about here. But still some of those beautiful acoustic led things, a Pink Floyd type song in there as well. It runs the gamut. It showcases their creativity and the wide breadth of their musical influences. And the fact that they can carry an Innocence disc without full-blown prog and still make it work and be a really exciting disc in their discography is a really great feat. And it ends with a really cool proggy cover of Bridge Over Troubled Water. But the real meat and bones of this release to me is the epics on the second disc, which has Not Afraid on it. And it also has Beyond the Years, which is just one of my favorite Neal Morse compositions of the modern era. I think it has a little bit of everything in its mixture, goes through all their different influences in fantastic fashion. It's always exciting. There's just some really epic guitar moments and keyboard moments and a cool drum and bass style part, and really surges in the moments it needs to. It's just a fantastic emotional statement by the group and includes all of the proggy stuff that you're looking for in the band. So it was just a fun, fresh breath of air after 2 giant double concept albums that came before it to just allow them to have fun and craft great, strong music. And I think it worked brilliantly well. It's a great release, and hopefully it's not the final Neal Morse Band release. Hopefully they continue to do more in this configuration. But there's just something magical about this group of musicians coming together and crafting something. It takes Neal's music to another level and adds these other members who are all stars and masterminds in their own right, allows them to contribute in a way that just makes this music excel in beautiful fashion. So really a fan of this disc and think it deserves a lot more praise and attention, in fact. At number 7, I've got Testimony 2 from 2011. And, I thought it was an interesting idea at the time to do kind of a sequel to one of his big concept records that had gotten a lot of acclaim and attention. How would that work? What does that even mean? And it's basically like all of the moments that you missed in Testimony, all of these personal stories that happened in his life that he didn't quite have time to put into Testimony are now in their own separate album. And you'd think that would sound like a pale imitation of what came before, or maybe like weird odds and ends that don't quite mix together very well. but somehow he crafts these alternate experiences into its own cohesive project, and it works as a complete album, just like Testimony before it did. And it's a great companion piece to Testimony 1. I think it showcases Neal at his emotional best. There's so many heartfelt, great songs on here. Jada is just a heart-wrenching moment that sticks with me whenever he plays it live. He always sheds tears over this one, about the experience that he had with his daughter's birth when she was young. It's just a fantastic record that showcases so many different sides to Neal. There's some fun bits, there's some cool, quirky things, there's plenty of prog overtures and excitement. And what makes this project even better is the second disc, which introduces one of his best epics from this period, Seeds of Gold, which another underrated epic. Shocking that it's basically on a bonus disc of one of his records, this premiere track that features like really cool classical infused piano and some Steve Morse just shredding as well. It's a fantastic piece of music, and I love Supernatural, which we actually played at my wedding, so that's a special song for me as well. So this project just it kind of falls through the cracks perhaps compared to a lot of his other solo concept records. It came after Lifeline, so it kind of feels a bit separate from his like core four concept records perhaps, but I think it belongs right in tandem with those. It's just a wonderful record that deserves a lot of praise, that has its own cohesive through line and has a brilliant epic conclusion, just like all of his albums do. So all right, so now at number 6, we've got The Great Adventure from 2019, the follow-up to The Similitude of a Dream. And maybe I have this a bit higher than the general consensus, I would guess. But I absolutely adore this record. I think that they were able to pull this off, that they made The Similitude of a Dream, which was possibly, I don't want to spoil my rankings left, but one of the peaks of Neal Morse's career as a whole. I think it was just such a surprise and such a great masterwork that came out, that they were able to follow it up and do an album that is up to the same level of quality of that record, and for me wasn't like a major disappointment or like a pale comparison to that album. I think it stands on its own. It has its own vibe and flavor from Similitude of a Dream, even though it follows a similar narrative and is a similar double disc album that travels a lot of different musical genres and styles in a similar fashion. But there's a bit of a darker edge to this, because this is about the son of the character of Similitude of a Dream, who's a bit moodier, has a bit of a darker spirit to him, and I think that's infused in the music in a really interesting, creative way. And there's just so many highlights throughout the record that really blow me away when I think through all of the wonderful tracks here. I love the Great Adventure title track. I think it's great, uplifting prog from Neal, very anthemic and fun. I love the conclusion of the record. I think it has a beautiful ending theme to it. I think there's some wonderful Eric Gillette singing and guitar moments that lift this up to new heights. I love the whole Vanity Fair, just a fun little diversion on the record into this more poppier aesthetic. There's so many great things. Child of Wonder is a beautiful section from Bill Hubauer. The whole Freedom Calling epic towards the ending is just fantastic and brings together all these elements from throughout the record. I love the dark melody from the earlier part of the record, just this really intense, theatrical kind of darker sound that I just absolutely love. And Love That Never Dies is just a fantastic theme that runs through the record, that he's able to be of the same level of quality as Similitude on this record, that it works as a really great companion to that piece, and frankly creates this like 4-disc epic concept record if taken together is just remarkable. And to me, this album in tandem with Similitude forms the core of the Neal Morse Band and what they were able to achieve as a collective. So I have to put it highly, and I think it deserves its spot here at number 6. But there's 5 records above it, if you can believe it, even though I consider that like a 5-star masterpiece. So we've got 5 other 5-star masterpieces to talk about here that I love with my whole heart. And we're going to start it off with number 5, Testimony, from 2003. And my story with this album is I got into Spock's Beard just as Neal Morse was leaving the band. That's when I discovered them. And I was devastated to hear that their core songwriter and lead member was leaving the band. I thought, okay, this is probably the end of Spock's Beard. This band I had just come into, that was now my new favorite band, was going to disband. And I was just really sad and frustrated. But to hear that Neal Morse was going to continue forward and make a concept record called Testimony, I was intrigued. I was a little bit concerned, like, was this going to go in a very different direction? Was it still going to have the progginess that I'd come to love and respect from the Spocksbeard collective? And it did, and it blew me away. I was obsessed with this record. It had all the progginess that I was looking for, a full-blown concept record. Neal had done this with Spocksbeard with Snow, which was a personal favorite of mine. I absolutely adore that record, but in some ways, this almost tops what he did with Snow, and he's able to really explore some really emotional ground, some stuff that's really meaningful to him personally. And I just absolutely adored this record. Listened to it on repeat. There's so many brilliant sections, so many things that just bring such emotional resonance to me. His story is just really heartfelt. And that's what I love about artists. Even if you don't agree with their beliefs, and, you know, a lot of people aren't really a fan of his, like, overtly Christian lyrics. But to me, what matters is that an artist is singing about what they're passionate for. And obviously, to me, he's singing with a lot of passion, and this is a subject that matters to him. It's his life story, essentially, and explains basically why he left Spocksbeard. And it was kind of a catharsis for a big fan of Spocksbeard. Like, okay, this is him explaining why he made this decision and how he's going to continue forward in this different manner. And I thought that was a really cool approach, and it just really was a special thing. And so some of those ballads are just so heartfelt and so beautiful. You know, you've got Somber Days, you've got It's All I Can Do, that are just really beautiful and just tell these very important parts of the story. I really absolutely love Oh to Feel Him. I think that's one of the emotional highlights of the record. But around it, you got some really cool proggy overtures. You got some really interesting musical sections that pluck through his different inclinations as a songwriter. You got a little bit of that kind of classical infusion. You've got a little bit of that, like, kind of Latin flavor in certain sections. So I just absolutely adore this record. I think it's straight from Neal's heart and explains perfectly who he is as an artist and what he plans to do moving forward from this point. And so it's just a beautiful record. And I'm really grateful that it exists and that it's really connected with me. It's, in fact, the first record I bought on vinyl when I got my record player not too long ago. So, of course, it has special meaning to me, and I'm happy to have it ranked here in my top 5. Number 4 for me is Question Mark from 2005. I think this is another great underrated record from Neal. It's cool because it's a single disc album rather than some of these sprawling double discs, which you could argue, you know, is that too much material? Is it too much to go through? When you do a double disc, there's bound to be filler material, stuff that you're just not as into as other stuff. But I feel like Question Mark, more than any of his other solo albums, is just very compact, and it's just a very digestible portion of music, and it all runs through. Like, there's not really divisible tracks completely, because I feel like it just feels like one cohesive piece of music, even though there's definitely sections that you can pull out and play separately. But and there's so many great instrumental fireworks on display. He pulls together a lot of interesting guests on this record as well to contribute solos and such. I love the whole In the Fire section, just allows for a lot of that instrumental firework. And there's so much emotional stuff going on in the second half as well. And it details a really interesting kind of biblical style tale, but done in epic prog fashion. It doesn't feel too preachy and too in your face. It's just an interesting perspective about the temple and how it's evolved through the years and what the temple means today. I really love how it's bookended by these the Temple of the Living God tracks that kind of bring it full circle and bring new meaning to this term. And I just love the emotion that Neal puts into this whole release and the cool kind of mysterious, quirky, proggy vibes. It feels like classic Neal Morse. It has all of his hallmarks, but in a more smaller, digestible package. I think it's just a perfect little album. And if you want to showcase to someone what Neal's all about, this is probably the album to do it, because it's not so sprawling that it's difficult for someone to get into, but it showcases all of Neal's best tendencies as a songwriter and is a very digestible chunk of music that I think a lot of people would enjoy in the prog sphere. And it's not too in your face with the religion aspect. It's more of a storytelling type album with a lot of quirky vibes and a big epic conclusion like he's known to do. So really fantastic record and one of his best for sure. At number 3, I have Sola Scriptura from 2007. I just fell in love with this record when I first heard it. I was blown away, actually, when I first heard this record, because it brought in this kind of new energy and this new heaviness into Neal's sound that I felt like he hadn't done quite to this degree as of yet. You know, it comes and kicks you right in the face, like right immediately with the first track, and it's epic, and it's fast-paced, and it's really heavy and dark in a lot of sections, and it's sprawling. There's these big epic pieces of music that go through so many different movements. It's just like everything in the kitchen sink of what Neal can bring into this music, but it doesn't sacrifice his tendency to write catchy melodies and hooks and some brilliant poppier sections that take you out of the heavier darkness. And there's moments that are just kind of quirky and strange almost. It's almost a weird concept if you really think about it. It's based on Martin Luther and his experience. And it just goes through so many different modes and movements, and it's just really fun to get through each of it. There's a cool Latin style theme section of cool acoustic guitar playing and just that kind of Senior Velasco type mentality in the conflict. Ends with such an epic note towards the end. I think it's just a fantastic conclusion, which ties together all of these moments and musical motifs from throughout the record. This is how you craft an epic album. This is how you make a concept record and tie everything all together in a fascinating, fantastic fashion. That epic guitar solo at the end of The Door is just one of those heart-wrenching moments that just really sings to me, and I just love every moment of this record. It lifts up to new heights. It has that heaviness. It has those moments of prog. It's fun to listen to. It's not too heavy. It's just heavy enough. It just sprinkles in just enough of that flavor to give you an edge, but to not overwhelm you. And I just think Neal brings everything to the table here that he's good at. And it just makes for a fantastic listen all the way through and something entertaining that always keeps my attention, even though it's a somewhat lengthier record. So definitely one of his high watermark albums, and I can understand people who rank this as his number one. Just a fantastic album all around, and another great introduction into his catalog, especially if you like kind of the heavier end of the prog spectrum, leaning into prog metal. I think this is probably the album to get you into Neal Morse's musical world. At number 2, ironically, I have One from 2004. This has always been a special personal album for me. And I maybe like it more than the majority of people. I'm not quite sure. I think it ranks high for most people, but for him to have such a grand scope, you know, he did his own personal story with Testimony, detailing his experiences and what brought him into the church and into, you know, being a Christian and embracing this Christian world and using that in his music. This one album kind of takes this to another level and looks at things from this grander scope of like the creation of the earth and the Garden of Eden and all of these like big touchstones from the Bible and from the world at large. You know, it goes into all these epic moments, but does it in a personal manner about the story of man being separated from God and being off on his own, but being able to return to live with him again in this glorious epic fashion, this glorious reunion that takes place at the close of the album. It's a beautiful storyline, and I think it's exceptionally realized. The whole epic of the creation is just so wide in scope and is so expressive musically, has so many different sections that really detail this like creation of the world and how it all takes place. You can visualize it in your mind as all these musical motifs are playing out, but there's plenty of fun like quirky jazzy moments to keep your attention and really interesting detailing of this biblical story that most people, I would imagine, are somewhat familiar with, of like the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and all of this kind of stuff going on in the mix. It's interesting to have kind of a proggy version of that if you really think about it. Author of Confusion brings kind of a darker edge, but brings those cool gentle giant rounds and those different styles to it. It makes for a super fun, exciting track. The Separated Man has really grown on me over time. I think it showcases the desperation and sadness of the main protagonist character and how separate and alone he is in this musical way that's just really brilliant and beautiful to listen to. It's just a really great epic track. Cradle to the Grave brings that really heartfelt emotion as you get this kind of two sides of the coin of the man and God kind of singing this almost duet together. It's a beautiful record with a lot of great touchstones of Neal's talent and a lot of his heartfelt emotion in the mix as well. Of course, it leans heavy on the Christian themes, as you can tell from my description, but it does so in a way that isn't too overtly preachy, isn't too in your face about it. It's just detailing this storyline, and if you want to take it as like a story of fiction that he's telling and weaving together, that's definitely an acceptable way to listen to this record. But it's just a beautiful experience front to back and showcases some of Neal's best emotional skills to be able to showcase this story through music, not just through the words, and allow you to feel the majesty of this glorious reunion and of man coming back together, and just how special and personal that feels to Neal and how glorious and magnificent the music conveys it. So just a beautiful record all in all, just perfectly realized, perfectly assembled together, and it's always touched me deeply as a record. It's one of my favorites of all time. But somehow Neal Morse topped even this record, which has always stood the test of time to be one of my all-time favorite records. He came out with the Similitude of a Dream from Neal Morse Band in 2016, which tops my list here. I don't know why, but it's just such a magical record that it's hard to pinpoint why it works so well for me. Because once again, it's a concept record across 2 discs of length, and it details this very spiritual style story, the Pilgrim's Progress story about a person, once again, who's on his own, who's going through a journey and trying to find meaning, find, home and peace through all of these different experiences, not unlike one that I just talked about. So it's not really any new ground for Neal Morse to do this kind of a story, but it's just so well told in the way that they go about this. It's just has so many key moments, so many things that really stand out as you listen through, and he's able to pull together all of these disparate styles and make it all work as one whole piece. It feels like it makes sense as one singular piece of music, even though it's so sprawling, even though he's drawing from a lot of different influences. I love the whole first disc. It's hard to point out the moments that stand out to me because it's all stand out. I really love Ways of a Fool. I think it's a fantastic chance for Bill Hubauer to stretch his chops and to give a more kind of quirky, poppy, proggy sort of track that is really catchy and fun to listen to. So Far Gone is just a beautiful track that showcases these emotions and these different strings and threads coming together. I love how that happens throughout these records, where you keep hearing different motifs return that help you along with the story and realize what is going on and how it connects to what's happened earlier in the story. The whole conclusion of the album is really where it shines for me. Just starting with The Mask and how interesting and theatrical and dark that is, running into, confrontation in the battle, where you get these epic prog flourishes and just everything comes to fruition, this big epic prog battle. I think that's a well done trope in prog music, where a lot of big prog epics detail different battles that happen. And it ends with this just next level conclusion. The Broken Sky Long Day Reprise is just beautiful music. It's epic in every way that it needs to be. Just when you think it's reached its height, it reaches another level with Eric Gillette's tenor voice shining through, and these epic guitar lines and guitar soloing just brings us to another level and never fails to give me goosebumps through every single listen to it. And it's hard. I feel like I'm not doing it justice because I don't want to go through every single, I could go through song by song and talk about why every single song is amazing on this record, but I don't want to make this video too epically long. I just want to give an impression of the fact that this is a beautiful record. Every track has its own unique flavor, but works together in tandem as a whole record. It showcases all sides of Neal Morse and the band that he's put together. It infuses something new and interesting and different into his mixture that had been missing up to that point in my mind with some of his records that had come just before this one, and showcase that he's still at the top of his game, can still craft a brilliant concept record that has a great narrative thread throughout, that never feels too messy or disparate, that works together as a cohesive whole, even though there's so much there to grab hold of, so many different styles, so many different things going on, that you'd think it would be a giant mess of different styles and different disparate tracks, but it all works together in tandem in a beautiful fashion, hooked together by all these great motifs and great storylines that hook you in and keep your rapt attention all the way throughout the runtime. And I know there was some infighting about if this album should have been a single disc or a double disc, and I think Mike Portnoy was on the side of wanting it to be a single disc at the time, but then has since kind of relented and said no. It ended up being one of our best, most brilliant albums, and it needed to be a double album. So really interesting look into their creative process and how this album came about, but I'm glad that it became the double disc that it is. I think it's absolutely brilliant and stands head and shoulders as one of the best examples of modern progressive rock, bar none, from any artist. I think this is a singular album that everyone who's a modern prog fan should listen to. It's just that good, and I would highly recommend it to everybody. It's just wonderful and a great return to form from Neal Morse, who never really dipped in quality anyways, but you could argue that his concept albums is where he really shines, and this was a return to doing those style grand concept records. So that's my list. That's my solo ranking. Hopefully it's not too overtly long. I know I get a little long-winded about talking about these records, but hopefully you found something to enjoy, especially if you're a big Neal Morse fan. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please check out these records if you haven't yet. If you got 50 minutes into a video about Neal Morse but have never heard of Neal Morse before, that's pretty remarkable. But please check out these records. All of them are very well worth your time and attention. He's one of my favorite artists for a reason. I think he's a brilliant songwriter, brilliant composer, just a fun individual who has great chops on his instruments and who brings together some brilliant minds in the progressive rock world. So what's there not to like? So thank you guys so much for joining me. And please stick around for future episodes. I'd really appreciate it. Subscribing would be great, and it helps the channel and helps me grow and have confidence to continue moving forward with videos like this. So thank you guys, and I'll catch you in a future episode. Bye, everybody.